Hello, all. Welcome back. All right, this is going to be the next lecture. I believe this is lecture 8, and this is going to be on Argentina. The title of the chapter is "The Economic Tango Continues." This is going to be a theme throughout the book. Is the economic issues of South America have been kind of crippling. If you look at Europe, they're generally doing okay. The Middle East generally doing okay because they have so much oil reserves. Asia is doing pretty well because they had the export oriented industrialization project. Latin America and Africa have largely been left behind. So um, that's going to be one of the main focuses of the book and of this course is we really need to focus on their economics to try to determine what happened, what can be fixed, etc. All right, so section 1 is just some basics on Argentina. Argentina is a decentralized federalist system. Buenos Aires, of course, is their capital. Um, it is a largely whitish country, right? It's a very I don't mean to say white, but it's like a very Europeanized country. Most of their immigration comes from Spain and Italy, but a very very white Euro country because it's not. They don't really have a history of slavery, right? So Brazil and many of the other economies were agriculture based, whereas Argentina was ranching based. Everything was based on cattle, and they still have a very large cattle industry where you don't need such intensive labor, right? And so they were able to, just hire people to do the job, or have sort of the local indigenous population help with the ranching. But it's far less like man intensive labor, right? Um, let's see, and then you get massive European immigration, especially the early 20th century into Buenos Aires. Especially, it's one of the booming capitals of the world at the point. It's sort of like London and Paris. It is a massive, massive capital. People are flooding into Argentina and Buenos Aires, um, seeing that it's going to be sort of the new Euro state. Unfortunately, that never really panned out. It's one of the better, I shouldn't even say better, it's one of the more developed economies, of course, in Latin America. But it never really turned out to be some, huge world buster, right? All right. Section 2 is on the Peronista movement. Um, Unfortunately, during World War II, the group of United Officers, the GOU, is in charge of the Argentinian state. They're Nazi aligned, and are sort of very enamored of Hitler and Mussolini of Italy. Um, and so they take over, and Juan Perón is like a sort of apparatchik, under this administration. Um, and Juan Perón moves from military to the Department of Labor. He takes over the Department of Labor, and he actually starts instituting all of these pro-labor edicts. Um, which was, kind of, I guess, fell in with sort of the Nazis philosophy, right? As long as you're the right color, the right, blood, then we're going to take care of you, right? So the Nazis did install a lot of sort of pro white, pro, Teutonic policies that really hurt immigrants and others while really helping bring up the poor of those who share the right bloodline, right? And so that's part of sort of the National Socialism part of Nazism is it was tied in some sense to socialism, but socialism for the right people, right? Okay. Perón takes over and he starts implementing all kinds of cool new labor laws. He develops pensions. He puts in insurance, not only health insurance but also like job insurance if you get injured on the job. Paid vacation was mandatory if you were a full time worker. He put in safety codes at factories for industrialization because this is the time that sort of Upton Sinclair's book The Jungle is coming out, or shortly after The Jungle is coming out, and people are starting to see some of the horrors of industrialization. Right, you also get minimum wage laws and maximum hour laws. So this huge burst of like pro labor stuff is coming from Juan Perón in the Department of Labor. Um, the military and the elites in the economy start to get pretty pissed off about this, and they jail Peron. But thousands of people from all across the country of Argentina show up, especially unions and laborers and union members. They're all out on the streets protesting, say "Free Peron, Free Peron." Peron is eventually released, and he actually wins the election in 1946. He's basically backed by unions, part of the military, like the army, but not the navy kind of thing. And in the Catholic Church, he makes all these sort of quid pro quos with the Catholic Church. I'll do this, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and we'll get the backing of the church as well. And Peron installs ISI, as many of these other countries did. I would say about 25% of you chose the ISI route on the papers last week, but that's going to be another theme of this is ISI versus EOI and Neolib and the Washington Consensus. So Peron really installs ISI in the 1940s, and it's working pretty well at first, right? And so they nationalize all these projects. They nationalize the banks. They nationalize the railroads and the telecommunications industry, which is sort of a newish industry at the time. They nationalize the utilities, so water and electricity. Excuse me. They nationalize the busing program across the country and provide free transportation. They tried to build sort of their own airline and their own steel mills. Those larger industrialized projects, as we've learned, sort of failed, whereas the smaller to medium level industrialization was relatively successful under ISI. But those were pretty poorly handled, and there was a lot of corruption. Uh, Unfortunately, Padron wasn't necessarily the best guy. He did tend to harass and repress other political parties and the media. He was nowhere near as bad as some of the Latin Americans, as we'll talk about later, even in Argentina. Uh, Unfortunately, ISI leads to huge debt, right? As we've learned. And this debt is really starting to saddle Argentina. His beloved wife, Evita, dies in 1952. And then things start to go wrong for Juan Perón. He tries to have his wife canonized by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church says, absolutely not. We don't want to get involved in the politics. Perón starts attacking the church, who's been one of his biggest backers, right, for a decade or more. Um, and a bunch of his supporters commit mass arson and burn down a whole shitload of churches in Argentina in 1955 in Buenos Aires. And so in 1955, a few months later, Perón is overthrown by the military when the Catholic Church basically ties in with the military, especially the Navy, and overthrows Juan Perón, and he flees, right? He goes to Spain. Um, Perón is in exile, but then he returns in 1973, and um, he wins the presidency, but he dies like nearly immediately, right? And his new wife Isabel takes over, but she is awful at her job, and she is overthrown in 1976 by the military. Um, Unfortunately, some really bad stuff happens under the military regime. There are quite a few leaders, but basically the military regime comes in and says we're gonna just imprison or kill anyone who's a quote unquote dissenter, right? And so anyone who's a leftist is arrested, tortured, disappeared. We're talking about tens of thousands of people who just basically disappeared off the face of the planet. And they're finding mass graves to this day of people who were brutally just murdered or tortured or bones broken and all kinds of horrible stuff. And these generally tended to be women and labor, like union leaders and union members, students from the colleges who would speak out, and then urban professionals like lawyers and people like that. Um, Under this regime, however, liberalization starts to occur, right? We see the Washington Consensus being put in. People are starting to become very skeptical of ISI. Um, and liberalization occurs. Unfortunately, it's pretty brutal, right? Laborers are forced in the factories at gunpoint to work. Soldiers are surrounding them saying, if you try to leave this job, we'll murder you. Unions are absolutely crushed. much of the assets that had been built up under Juan Perón and Peronism, whatever you want to call it, are sold off, right? And many times to foreigners, and massive, massive unemployment ensues. And so the whole society is furious, right? Um, and so the military finally decides to step down. Alfonsin is elected in 1983. And at this point, much of Latin America is turning toward democracy, right? Brazil is going to follow in 1985, Peru, and others. Um, Alfonsin comes in and starts to prosecute some of the former military leaders for human rights abuses. He doesn't really get to go very far because debt is huge. Inflation is rising fast. They have hyperinflation. He loses his position pretty quickly. They're rolling through a string of heads of state, basically. And then you get Carlos Menem in 1989, and he is also pushing further neoliberalism. But it's not necessarily his choice, right? The IMF and the World Bank and the US are saying if you don't do this, then to hell with you. Like you'll deal with the consequences, whether it be hyperinflation or not. And so Carlos Menem moves toward, the Washington Consensus. Um, a lot of Argentinian businesses at this point collapse because they cannot compete with the West. They can't compete with the cost of making products. And so unemployment explodes in the late 1990s. And then here come the Kirchners, right? So again, there's a string of leaders. The Kirchners come in. Nestor Kirchner takes the presidency in 2003, and his wife is Cristina Fernandez Kirchner. And they're basically the leader for the next 15 years between the two of them. They take a more like Peronist move. They're members of the Peronist movement. They take a leftist approach. They increase social welfare dramatically. Um, Poverty starts to drop pretty dramatically. They're providing education for the first time to the poor. They're providing infrastructure to the poor. They're providing small handouts for the poorest of people, especially like we've talked about. If your kids go to school, and you do your like annual health checkups, we'll send you a little bit of money every month. And so this is known as sort of Kirchnerismo. Um, and so, unfortunately, what happens is Nestor is elected, and then he steps down in 2007, um, to have Cristina replace him, his wife. And Cristina wins the election handily. And then the plan was for Nestor, after Cristina's tenure, was to run again, but Nestor died in 2010. And so Cristina Fernandez Kirchner is reelected in 2011. Things went pretty well under the Kirchners. Honestly, they did pretty well to get through 2008 crash, 2007 and 8 crash. Things weren't perfect, right? But they were improving the situation in Argentina and making them a little bit more of like a trade power, right? Um, and then in 2015, the mayor of Buenos Aires, Mauricio Macri, takes power. He's much more sort of right wing. He was also like one of the very first who was not one of the two major parties, right? And this seems to be a tradition that's starting to happen in Argentina, where someone who's not one of either the Radical Civic Union or the Peronist Party takes the presidency and is taking massive power in the legislature. So not only was Mauricio Macri sort of independent, but their most recent president, who was elected last year, maybe early this year, Milei, he is also he calls himself a libertarian, right? He's not a part of either one of these political parties. He's a heavy critic of both of them. He's an economist, largely of the sort of Chicago School of Economy, University of Chicago School. He's very neoliberal. He espouses selling off all of their assets, but also taking over the central bank, dollarizing the economy, all of this stuff. So far, so good. It's only been less than a year. I think he surprised a lot of people with how well he's done, to be perfectly honest. But time will tell, right? That's one of the stories of Brazil is things were looking really great for a little while under Lula da Silva, and then they handed things over to Dilma Rousseff and then Jair Bolsonaro, and things got really bad. So time will tell with Milei. Okay. Section 3, society. Uh, it's one of the most urbanized nations on earth. About 92% of Argentinians live in an urban center, with about one third of the entire population living in Buenos Aires, mostly Spanish and Italian. Very, very high literacy rate, right? Like they can compete with Euro countries when it comes to these sort of social indicators. So very, very high literacy rates, like 97%. I mean, they're beating the United States at this point. Low infant mortality rates, higher life expectancy rates than in the United States and some European countries. So yeah, they also, like I said, they never really had the slavery tradition like Brazil and many other South American countries did because they were cattle, not ag. And so they have a much more Europeanized, less mixed society than you would ever see in like Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and others. Okay. Section 4 is about the political parties. We'll really just touch on the two. It's been mostly just the two parties during the 20th century. So you have the Peronists, who started under Juan Perón, of course. They've largely been tied to labor and any capitalists, like entrepreneurs who were living off state largesse, right, during sort of the ISI period. And then the bureaucracy, which is pretty bloated, as we've talked about before. And then on the other side, you have the Radical Civic Union, and this is generally the middle class and the elites fighting against redistribution, basically. But the whole country has sort of been moving away from either one of these. Like we talked about, Macri was not a member of either of these parties, and Milei is a titled libertarian, and he despises both of the political parties. So I don't know if that trend will continue, but it looks like the political parties are starting to lose power in Argentina. Section 5 is about the government and the government setup. So the Constitution of 1853 is based largely on the United States Constitution, though they don't necessarily have the same sort of checks and balances, co-equal branches, etc. It is a federal republic. They have 23 provinces and a federal district. Um, they have a Bill of Rights that guarantees freedom of religion, freedom of speech, all of these things. But it, it sounds friendly on paper, but under certain regimes, it doesn't really matter because those things don't exist because they're not enforced, right? So it's sometimes like, yes, this is written down in our constitution, but is that the reality? Not always. The president dominates the system in Argentina. This is unlike the U.S., right? The U.S. has a lot of checks and balances. A lot of these Latin American countries really don't. They have this very, very top-heavy presidency, super presidency kind of system. So neither the Congress nor the courts are necessarily really independent or co-equal in any sense. The legislature is made of two houses, the Senate. So you have three senators from every district and then three from that federal district. So that's 72 senators. You have 257 member Chamber of Deputies. Um, Unfortunately, they have very low experience, very little pay. It's not very prestigious. They don't have a lot of power. They have weak committees, and so it's all about the presidency, right? They don't serve as much of a check. The executive is by direct election. It is a 4-year term, and they are allowed to be reelected one time. And they have pretty strong powers, right? They have not only the veto power, but also a line item veto, which is very different from the United States. Man, that sun is great. Um, they have what's called the state of siege power. So if they declare like we're in a national or constitutional or economic emergency, then suddenly there's no constitutional limits on the president, which has been an approach of Macri and of the Kirchners and of Millet. They can intervene on the regional level, right? So the president can step in. Basically, it would be like the president of the United States stepping in and being like, "All right, Greg Abbott, that law is wiped off the books in Texas." Like they have that kind of power, which is wild. And then they also have executive orders with the force of law. Like they can basically just write laws from scratch. They don't have to just like tinker around the edges of laws that already exist, like they do in the United States. They can just sort of create laws by fiat, which is really weird, right? So I don't know if weird, but it's just very different from our system. All right, that's all I've got for Argentina. The next will be Brazil. I will have all of these lectures up by the end of day tomorrow, Wednesday, and I'll also have the essay questions for the next roundup. So thanks for being here and have a great day.